great news that it's exciting. President Biden has announced that by July 4th, 3 people can get together, so as long as they're related in the same family, if they've all been vaccinated, and they can take their mask off for a second. 3 people after July 4th, if you're related and you've been vaccinated. I mean, how out of touch is that? I mean, does he go out? Does he know any real people? Is anybody paying attention to anything he is saying? Does he really think that he's sort of instilling confidence in us by going on a Zoom call and putting a mask on? Has Dr. Fauci told him that he can catch it through the webcam somehow? I mean, this is insane. But these are the people leading our country and telling us, what we can and cannot do. The governor's not a lot better. In fact, I would say the governor's worse than most of the Democrat governors around the country as far as his restrictions. And I think the burden should be on these people. If they're going to take your freedoms from you, the burden on them is to prove that there's some kind of science. I still might oppose it even if the science were there, but they need to have a burden to prove to us that what they're doing and telling us actually has some science that supports that it would actually work. There really isn't any. The trajectory of the virus probably was unaltered by any of the things you were told to do. In fact, the whole idea of 6-foot distancing or 3-foot distancing, they've now said probably none of that makes any sense, and it can probably spread 50 feet. And so there probably were times in a very enclosed setting when people hadn't been vaccinated and it was all throughout your community that being inside with other people probably wasn't a good idea. But the thing is it kind of depends on who you are. There are different risk factors based on different people. If you're 25 years old, the death rate is higher for being struck by lightning. You're more likely to be struck by lightning under 25 than to die from COVID. But if you're over 70 or over 70 and overweight, your risks go up dramatically. And there is a real risk. I don't think we should say there's no risk. There is a real risk for certain people. And so I'm not opposed to the vaccine. I think people ought to take it if you're in a risk category. If you're younger or if you think you've had it, I think it's a reasonable thing to be tested to see if you have antibodies to it already. I had it last spring, and so far there's no evidence of the immunity waning. And people say, well, you don't know. You don't know how long your immunity is going to last. And I was like, well, you don't know how long the vaccine is going to last. I mean, none of us know how long this will last, but common sense usually tells you that when you've had a previous infection with something, you have some immunity. And I didn't get any symptoms the last time. I think I probably won't get many the next time since I already have some immunity to the disease. But that's my decision. I'm not going to tell you what to do. In a free society, everybody judges their own risk. You're going to decide whether to get in a car, which is extremely dangerous, much more dangerous than anything you'll do in your life is a car. But we don't submit to the government that the government's going to put a governor on our car that we can't go more than 25 miles an hour. We'd save a lot of lives, but we just sort of accept the risk. I heard someone giving a speech the other day and they were talking about, an invention. And if there was this invention, but we knew it would aid in commerce and it would speed up a lot of things in our life and our life would be materially better, but 40,000 people would die a year if we allowed this invention to come forward. Would you do it? And most people are like, no, that sounds terrible, all these deaths. Well, that's the car. I mean, the car has all these pluses, but it still has lots of deaths that we get from cars each year. So we've sort of lost our head in the sense that really we should think about risk, make these decisions individually, and it's sort of to each his own. While I'm a big advocate of taking the vaccine, my parents won't take it. They're in their 80s, but they won't take it. And that's, and if you've met my dad or read about dad, he is going to make his own decisions and he's not going to listen to his kids. But several of us are doctors and work with COVID patients and have taken it. After I had COVID, I went to the hospital and volunteered in the hospital for a few weeks. But the one thing I will tell you is the rules in the hospital, for safety's sake, is if you go in a COVID patient's room, you wear an N95 mask. You don't cut up your T-shirt and put your T-shirt on your face. It doesn't work. I mean, they've done studies on this. So when Fauci first came out, he said, none of the masks work. And he knew that that was a lie. It's what Plato called a noble lie. He thinks we're too stupid to understand the truth, but he didn't want you to buy the N95 mask because he thought they needed to be in the hospital first and we'd run out. And it's not a reasonable thing, but we should just be honest with people and say, look, we're going to ask the suppliers to send the N95 masks to the hospital first. They are the best masks and they work. Instead, he said when he finally came out, it said none of them worked. Then 3 weeks later, he came out and said they all work. It's equally not true, because if you blow particles through a cloth mask the same size as a virus, 97% of the particles go right through the cloth mask. So the cloth masks really don't work. The surgical masks are a little bit better, and then the N95 masks work. One of the things that Dr. Fauci could spend some time telling us, but he's not telling us, I'm going to tell you today because it's the most important thing. We're still going to get COVID. It's not as active out there. It's a lot less active, but you still may have somebody who's a family member or friend who gets it in town, and this is what you need to know, and it can save your life. If you get it, you've got a bronchitis, and you begin coughing, there is a treatment, and it reduces your death rate like 80%. It's called monoclonal antibodies. Donald Trump got them. Chris Christie got them. Giuliani got them. I have a family member who had metastatic cancer. She got them and survived. So the thing is people can survive, and these really work, but there's a window of time. If you wait too long, I had a friend who's about 41, overweight. He got it, almost died, but he waited too long. But nobody was telling him he needed to get to the hospital sooner. You can't wait, and like most men, I don't want to make a sexist argument, but men resist going to the doctor. They just stay home. But if you get COVID and you're coughing, you need to get in to see the doctor because there is a treatment, and it reduces your death rate 80%. Instead, you've got people like Sanjay Gupta and Dr. Fauci on TV saying, oh, the mask is the most important thing. It's more important than the vaccine. Well, no, it's not. The mask really probably doesn't work much at all. Almost everybody that's gotten the infection in the last 2 months, as the numbers went like this, said they were wearing their mask all the time. So frankly, you can get it with your mask. The vaccine probably does work 90-some-odd% of the time, 95% of the time. So really the answer to stopping this is either natural immunity, which a lot of people have gotten, plus the vaccine. Now, they completely discount it. The reason why Fauci is still so upset and why Bashir is acting like a crazy person is that they don't count natural immunity, the people who have had it. So 32 million people, there's a website, you can see how many people have had COVID. 32 million people have had it. But the CDC, which is very conservative and not tending to exaggerate, estimates that 2 people for every 1 person is listed have gotten it. Why? Because a lot of young people got it and they didn't know it. So if you got it and one of you had the flu and you know you had COVID last year and you have 2 kids, chances are your kids may have had it and you just didn't know it if you didn't test them. So there's at least 2 for every 1, which means we have 100 million people in our country who have had it. That's 1/3 of the country had it, but we also have over 1/3 that's vaccinated. Now, there's some overlap, but really we are close to the 2/3 that we kind of need, 2/3 plus some. And so I think we're very close to being over it, and I can see by the crowd here you guys kind of think we're beyond this, and I think we may be. But we've got to really get to the point where we can get back to normal. Probably, and Adrian can reinforce this, probably the worst thing that's happened is at the state level with the powers that the governor has assumed. So we have a couple of problems in Kentucky. The governor assumed these powers in March. They went out of session, and so for 9 months, our legislature is completely powerless. To me, this is sort of reminiscent of when the king would dissolve Parliament. When he got mad at Parliament, he would just kick them out, and they couldn't come back, and he wouldn't let them come back in session. I think that's a defect in our state. I think we need to allow power for the state, for the legislature to come back in session. Now, if you want to limit what they come back in for, that'd be fine. You could say they only come back in maybe to discuss or debate edicts, that the governor puts forward. But we have to allow them to have the power to come back in. Otherwise, for 9 months, he is essentially a dictator. So when they came back in legislative session in January, there's emergency rules that were given to the governor back in the 90s. When the bill was passed, I think people assumed it would be like a tornado hits Lawrenceburg and the National Guard brings you blankets and food and water. Most of us would accept that as an emergency. But if you want to close a restaurant down for a year and say you can only have 25% occupancy, that's a policy. That's like legislation. That's not an emergency. That's not a 3-day thing where we're helping people with water and food. This is a major economic policy. And to say that only one person can do that with his sole authority, with no checks and balances from the legislature, is awful. I think this is the biggest constitutional issue, bigger than, I know there's a lot of important stuff in Washington. The issue we have with the governor and unlimited power is the biggest issue of our time. It's going to be decided by the Supreme Court. So the state legislature passed a law restricting his powers, and he immediately went to court, sued them, got a liberal judge in Frankfurt. Surprise, surprise. I don't know how he found a liberal judge in Frankfurt. I guess the opposite would really be true. Could you find a conservative judge in Frankfurt? But anyway, the judge put an injunction, and now it's going to go to the Supreme Court in June. But the governor is arguing that he has inherent power. I'd say he's been anointed by God. He's like a king of old. He's been told, and this is what he argues, that he can do whatever he wants no matter what the state legislature says. This goes against everything we know and care about as far as separation of powers and checks and balances. This is a big deal. But what really worries me is that I think the Supreme Court could rule in his favor. I don't know how they could possibly justify ruling against the state legislature amending their own laws to limit his power. But if we say the government